40 years ago, Catalan writer Roser Capdevila created the series The Triplets. The Triplets is a series of books for children where 3 triplets, of course, or 1 triplet, based on her daughters, are pulled into a well-known story or novel, and they mess things up. And it was an instant success. So much so that it's been translated into multiple languages and it's available in almost worldwide. It's been 40 years after all. There's like a TV show and 250 different books, etc., etc. And the story is always following the same pattern. The boring witch, which is a character on the series, is bored. So she needs something to do, so she goes and checks on the triplets. The triplets happen to be messing something up or maybe planning a prank or something like that. And as a punishment, the boring witch will cast the triplets into a story, into a well-known novel. The problem is this story is twisted or the triplets mess with it, more or less like Marty McFly messes his parents' meeting on Back to the Future. Few pages later, the boring witch joins the mess and tries to teach the triplets a lesson. After all, they were messing up, they were pranking someone, so there has to be some morale for them. By a coincidence of events, the triplets fix everything and the boring witch takes them back, right? Okay. The Wikipedia page explaining the same information goes like this. The plots of the triplet sisters follow a definite pattern. Sometimes they play some prank or manage to annoy the bored witch. And to punish them, she sends them into a classic tale, legend, or children's adult, such as Frankenstein or Phantom of the Opera, literal work. The main structure of the classic remains, but some twists, often hilarious anachronisms, such as showing the 40 thieves getting distracted from robbing the house by a camel race or TV or Dr. Frankenstein, are introduced to favor each plot and define the sisters' personalities. That was a mouthful. What I would fix in this write-up is the following. The plot of the triplets, blah, blah, blah. Sometimes they play some prank, comma, Oxford, comma, or manage to annoy the bored witch, period. As a punishment, comma, she sends them into blah, blah, blah. Remove the examples, literary work. And would rewrite completely the second sentence. I ran out of breath, and I was, even if I was reading it on my internal dialogue, I would suddenly not know where I'm at anymore. Even the parenthesis part on the second part is longer than the non-parenthesis part. It doesn't make sense. So, put another way, I would have focused on the plot structure, I would have explained examples in a follow-up paragraph, I would have kept sentences shorter and simple. And this should sound familiar because I would have put production code in source main, I would have put tests in source tests, I would have used smaller functions and composed them, right? But let's review again. We have a list of steps, a list of things that happen one after the other. So I used an ordered list because the order matters. And we know that when order matters, we have HTML tags for ordering. And if the order doesn't matter, I will use an unordered list. But let's get a bit more meta. I use the imperative. Like I said, use order list when the order matter. Don't use order list when order doesn't matter. Instead, use order list. So use a positive sentence with an imperative form. Imperative, right? There's one detail on this write-up, which is these 2 sentences. Always prefer direct form over passive form, unless there is no other choice. The boring witch is bored. No one's responsible for that. There is no subject on this sentence. The story is twisted. There is no subject on this sentence. So use the passive form. Now what just happened? For the past 5 minutes, I've been delivering content on an international conference. I didn't introduce myself. I didn't tell what the talk is about. I didn't set the stage, right? In documentation, or when sending a calendar invite for a meeting, there are some expectations that you, as the creator of that content and documentation, as the creator of that event on the calendar, you are expected to fulfill. For example, you will not call for a meeting without sharing some agenda, without sharing some expectations. So in documentation, you can follow these you have to follow these same rules. And here's, for example, one format that you can follow. First, state your audience. Second, manage the expectations. Deliver the content. Then review the expectations. And close with, OK, if you want to know more, some links and follow-ups. Because this is a talk, I will add one extra step, which is introduce myself. Okay? So let's start over. Good morning. Welcome to GeeCON 2023. It is October. We're in Prague. My name is Ignasi Marimon-Clos Sunyol. I'm from Barcelona. This session is called The Emperor Has No Dogs. As usual, this is the tooling you can use to ask questions at the end of the session. Remember, we are on room 6. So, who am I? I'm a level 23 developer. The old ones will understand that. But you should expect that already. You should probably knew. Because if you check the GeeCON site, you would see that I'm a breaker of CI builds. I'm not advocate, and I'm not CTO of something or stuff like this, right? There's only one more thing that I need to share about myself that's relevant, which is that I am not a graphics designer. This is about my personal journey, and I'm mold, which means that this talk will be very long. There's 170 slides or more. I will try to cover it as fast as I can. I will speak very fast, so here we go. This is the target audience. I expect today to deliver some content that's meant for senior developers, junior developers, remote workers, royalty, and peasants. Now, in case you haven't, on the website of the GeeCON of the conference, I shared what you should expect today. And to simplify things for you, in case you haven't read it, what I will do is rewrite these 2 paragraphs into a different format. So I'm adapting the same content to a different format because the audience today is live, time matters. When you read that at home, time didn't matter as much. Those 2 paragraphs can be simplified into this. First, I'll cover my personal journey from not writing documentation into writing documentation. Second, I will share some tips and tricks that I developed, that I learned, that worked for me. You may need different tips and tricks yourself. Third, I will share how I developed the habits to never again forget about writing the documentation. And finally, I will share how and when writing documentation can save money. And last, I will show or share my experience countering the arguments against we don't need documentation, we don't want documentation, I don't want to write that. Okay? So, like I said, I'll start with my journey. I said I'm a level 23 developer, but I was not always like that. I used to be an esquire. I was living on some stables. Every morning I would walk on this pissy rain, like here in Prague, to the castle, and there I will just man the stables, right? Or put another way, I would read the specs, I would write some code, I would write some tests, and I would write documentation. Except that's a dream. That's not really true. What I would do really, like many people, is I would skim the specs, write some code, realize I didn't understand the thing, deploy, maybe read the specs again, code again, deploy, and of course, no tests and no documentation. Over and over and over and over. We've been here. So, like in the movie, this is the Groundhog Day. I will not go into detail. I realized that I need to better myself. Okay? So I did. I attended some conferences, I went to some meetups, and I learned about testing and this and that. And I said, okay, this is a lot better. I am now more careful. I now read the specs, ask for clarification, I ask for some overview over the test that I'm writing, and then I code. But at some point, after this bettering myself, I realized that, hold on, I'm still not writing documentation. There's something here. I still feel like an esquire. Until one morning, on my daily stroll from my stable to the castle, I met the triplets. They were just sitting there, hacking on some stuff under the tree, and I said, hey, what are you guys doing here? Oh, we're here on your story to help you, Ignasi. And yes, I'm all for it. Ignasi, what do you need? when you're on a whirlpool and you're just circling, like in the Groundhog Day, you need someone to kick you out of it. You need a kick. You need to develop yourself a personal kick to help you get out of this cycle, right? So this is what I didn't plan for that. It just happened. I did docs, and only docs, for several days or even weeks. I joined a company that was doing open source, and I joined immediately after a release, so it meant we had to write a lot of documentation, and that was great. I had no idea how to write open source documentation, public-facing, worldwide available. And that was a shock of truth. And then I realized, hold on, how did I learn programming? How did I learn testing? Focusing on one thing. The moment that I'm context switching, I'm missing the possibility to create some mental patterns. And so that was a very good realization moment for me. But then I asked the triplets, yeah, okay, I'm developing some memory muscle, but I need more. I still don't know how to organize the information that I'm putting out there. And they said, okay, there's plenty of resources, and here's 3, for example. The 4C model, the 4 C's of effective talks. Oh God, we are terrible at acronyms and names. It's 2 different things, same thing. And lastly, the DBA documentation system. I will very, very, very briefly cover these. These are not the purpose of this talk. So the 4C model, context, container, component, and code. Your documentation should be different depending on the layer. And what does this mean? For example, context. Where I work, we are an OTA with 4 BUs. Or, hold on, we are an online travel agency with 4 business units. That's it. That's my context. If you ask more about my documentation, it will be about travel agency, flights, cars, hotels, etc., etc. Okay? Container is how we handle bookings, or we have another service for recommendations, we have another service for reviews, etc., etc. Component, in the case of bookings, I can explain how a booking requires steps A, B, C for persistence, mail the user, etc. And code, we are familiar with code. There's some classes interacting with each other, there's this sequence diagram, etc. Right? It's different layers, and you can distribute the information by knowing where it belongs, by doing this partition. Right? Now, another thing that is useful, and maybe not as in depth, deep, it's the 4 C's. The documentation has to be clear, concise, correct, and complete. No big news there, right? Because we are developers, and it's the similar properties from our code. Of course, our code has to be clear, concise, correct, and complete. And finally, and this is my favorite, the DBA system. The DBA company or group, I'm not entirely sure what their background is, shared a long time ago this blog post where they presented how they separate documentation. It's one model, there's more, there's one that uses like 12 different approaches, yada, yada. And it works like this. Tutorials, it's a type of documentation that will take your user from nowhere to having something that works, not knowing how they got from nowhere to here. It doesn't matter. Take as many shortcuts as you can for that user to have something that works. When the user has something that works, focus on the how-tos. And the how-tos will take the user from A to B. Oh, I have the Spring Boot application up and running, and now I want to have a Spring Boot application with persistence. I have the Spring Boot application that's running. I want the Spring Boot application deployed. And I want it deployed with persistence. Okay, close the circle. Right? Explanation. This is the most general or the type of documentation that we can think about. I have a framework. I need to explain all the features, how these features interact with each other. If I open the Hibernate documentation, this is what I'm looking at. This is the website for Hibernate documentation, for example. And finally, the reference is the Java doc. It's what you put next to the code. It's what you go to when you need to have more detail in every single gaudy edge case details, right? So we have these 3 learning pieces. And I will add a bonus one that I reserved for later, which is the Google Tech Writing course. These courses are just brilliant. And I will tell you a secret. I've given you a digest of these courses on the first few slides. When I was talking about the triplets, the order list, non-order list, how I, at some point, avoided using an acronym. It's things that I internalized doing this course from Google. For example, an order list, or the structure of a good documentation. So, at this point, having read about all that, having learned all this, and as I was starting to practice, I was no longer a squire. I was now a castle guard, and I got to live in the basement there. And then one day, I was on a walk and realized that, okay, sometimes I still forget. I need to develop it. This context switching is too expensive for me, so I need something else. And fair enough, I met the triplets again, and they said, yeah, you have to develop some tricks. You have to develop these tricks to avoid the writer blockage or fight the blank page syndrome. The blank page syndrome is a blockage that you have when you have an empty file, an empty wiki page. You don't know where to start, right? If you remove these impediments, and then it will be very easy to just start working on micro improvements. So the worst part is make the page not blank. And once you've done the page not blank, commit, push, and focus on baby steps. Another trick, make sure that you don't forget by creating explicit tasks. We know that that's an anti-pattern. We don't create a task, test this feature. We don't create a task for do the feature A, test the feature A, document the feature A. It's all part of the definition of done. So until you get there, until the team is there, until you're personally, mentally there, do this. Create the task. Or even better, create a task and do it first so that you never forget, so that it won't be boring anymore for you. Okay? Or you can start building some muscle memory. How did you learn to write tests? You learn to write tests by practicing and practicing and practicing. You went to meetups, you did coding katas, you did a breakfast. Breakfast is a term that I love, which is every morning, before I start doing the production work, I reserve a Pomodoro 30 minutes to practice what I'm trying to improve at. Can be testing, can be this technology, can be writing documentation. In my case, when learning documentation, these 30 minutes were actually writing improvements on production documentation. So a month later, it was all better, right? And if you start squinting a little, and if you've heard me say this multiple times, let's, all of you do me a favor, squint a little, and start thinking that maybe docs are tests that I will not ever need to compile. Okay? And let's take this analogy. Okay? I'm not saying that's the case, it's just an analogy. I said that documentation has to be clear, complete, concise, correct, etc., etc. We have different levels at the context, at the container, at the code, etc. And I just said that to improve at that, you can do them first. Okay? And by doing them first, in the case of documentation, you also gain a few things. For example, you prevent the expert paradox. The expert paradox is a situation in which the person that knows the most about something is incapable of explaining that something. The most common example in computer science is monads. Once you understand monads, you cannot explain monads. But it's very common. If you do documentation at last, you will know so much about the implementation that you will get dragged into the implementation details. And you will get dragged into sharing some things that will couple your documentation to the implementation. And that's an anti-pattern. That's something that you should prevent. And that's another advantage of doing the documentation first, is that you will just focus on naming things. And that will help you develop the ubiquitous language. That if at any point you need to talk about something and you don't know what name to give it, grab someone by the neck and share or have some extra inputs to develop this ubiquitous language. Now, following with this analogy. A few weeks ago, I was working on this method. This is some Scala code with asynchronous yada yada. Doesn't matter, not relevant. Before implementing it, we knew we had to implement this method signature. It doesn't matter what it does. But it's tricky, so we were pre-programming and we said, okay, before we go on, let's try to understand what it should do. So we wrote the Scala doc for that method. This is exactly how that method behaves, how it should behave. And once we realized we were covering all edge cases, once we realized that we had all cleared it, it was all clear in our heads, we took that 2 paragraphs and rewrote them into tests. This is Scala test. Scala test has this nice thing that you don't have to tweak method names like in JUnit. You can actually make the test name a string. So we did the docs, we did the test, and finally we implemented the thing. Right? Let me push this analogy a bit further. We all know that in tests we talk about test coverage, and we know that no coverage is bad and 100% coverage is also bad. Well, in documentation we talk about salt. When you eat food, it has no salt, it's bad, it's bland. If it has too much salt, you cannot eat it either. Right? So you also have to work on finding this sweet spot for yourself. But let's take it further and talk about roles. In tests, we have QAs, and even if there's a QA person with full dedication to QA in my team, I will still write tests. And of course, in documentation, there's tech writers. And even if there's a tech writer in my company, I will still need to write documentation. And maybe the tech writer will come later, make a uniform style, or improve my write-up, or whatever. Okay? So, do it first, do it from the outside. So it keeps popping similarities with tests. Outside in, detail as you dig. But the last point here is my favorite one, which is when you do tests first, you focus on the API. You put yourself on the user's shoes. You understand what the user will see when interacting with your code. So you are somehow developing this empathy to how the user will feel when using your API. And with documentation, it will be the exact same thing. If you document first, you will understand, okay, I don't know anything about the feature, the framework, the library, the service that I need to learn about. And that's the mental state in which you are when you write the documentation first. So, documenting is a show of empathy and respect because it means that you put the extra 2 minutes to understand where this person is at in terms of knowledge. And I realized this when I realized that there's several layers of communication, several levels, which are real-life conversation. I get the actual voice and sound and visual cues and nonverbal communication. I can have a call and still lose the nonverbal communication, but have all the communication there. We can do messaging over Slack, or we can do email, which is a bit more asynchronous and sometimes more broadcasty. And then I have documentation in which I tell you something. I don't know when you will read it. I don't know who will read it. So I have to be sure that this message is correct. I don't have feedback asking, hey, what do you mean in this sentence? Okay? So I have to be more mindful of the mental state of the reader. Because documentation is write once and read anytime, anywhere, anyone. So being mindful of the user. The documentation that we write most often, and I'm now squeezing it in, is pull requests. And in pull request, if you're mindful of the reviewers and you help them understand early on what to focus on, oh, you can skip this part because just linting, formatting, and you can skip that part because it's accidental complexity, or this was just a typo, or simply read this block first, ignore all the rest. This will speed up and will benefit everyone. Be sure to add some description, because the description, if you're using GitHub, will end up on the commit, so that 3 years from now, when I'm checking that commit, I will see the message there. I will not even have to open the Jira ticket, even if it's on the title. Okay? So, some tricks. Review. Do them first to prevent the expert paradox, develop the ubiquitous language, and fight the naming nightmare that we all live in. Add visuals. Spend the 5 or 10 necessary minutes on Keynote, PowerPoint, tool of your choice, Draw.io, to add something that will help transmit that message. And when you do all that, when you do it first, you can then very easily copy-paste in a PR description, cross-link from the Java doc. So it comes for free, and suddenly all this cross-referencing will not come at any cost. Finally, when you do it first, it will help you detect unknown unknowns faster. Suddenly you'll realize that I don't know how to name this. I don't know how to do, what to do when this happens. Okay? So if you do docs first, if you do tests first, once you have the task 90% done, the only thing that's missing is writing the code. And at this point, I usually have a question, which is, Ignasi, but what you're saying is that we should write the specification first. No. Documentation is not specification. Specification is, you developer have to do that, what I want you to do. Documentation is why we did it, how you use it. I don't care what internals it has. In most cases, maybe in the reference, you need to detail a bit of the internals. Okay. So, at this point, I was no longer a castle guard. I was now a archer. I could live on no longer on the basement. I had a very nice room with a window. So I needed to still keep improving myself. I had those tricks, I had the kicks, and now I had to work on the habits to not forget. And so again, I went for help from the triplets. And the triplets said, okay, one of the best ways to make new habits, to adopt new habits, is learn about system 1, system 2. System 1 is what makes you behave in a fight or flight. System 1 is part of your brain. You don't even need to think, right? You just realize that when something happens, you react this way. And that's the interesting thing. When you build a trigger, when this something happens, I behave this way, is what will make your habits strict. And when this happens is what some people call the trigger. So focus on the triggers. Realize that when this happens, you have to react this way, right? So here's some of my triggers, for example. When coding, I shouldn't need to select names. If I find myself selecting names, it's because I didn't put them on documentation first. And what I do is I don't spend a single second on names. And my code is full of fools and name this later and yada yada. And when I commit, the PR is on draft. I review how many fools and yada yadas I have. Then I go, I focus on names, I fix the code and go. So I don't need to context switch. I reserve the naming part of my brain for later. When waiting for the build to complete, when waiting for something else to happen, write some docs. Don't just look at the paint getting dry. If, when creating a PR, you don't have a link to some documentation, it's probably because you forgot, it's probably because it's a detail that needs documenting and it's not documented yet, just first. And finally, but that's more of a group thing, not just a personal thing, prefer suggestions over comments. When I'm commenting, hold on, can that be a suggestion? Yes. For example, in the first image, there is a typo. Instead of saying, hey, there's a typo in Gaul, you can use GitHub's suggestion feature to fix it and just move on. Or even better, don't do anything and just accept that the Tibulus, the demon of typos, will squeeze into your docs unless they are public-facing because you're open source, yada, yada. Just accept that some docs is better than no docs. So don't even say there's a typo in Gaul, okay? Just follow the improv rule, which is yes and, which means this is great, approve, and later I will fix it on a separate PR that won't even need deployment, right? Never be the extra friction on someone who paid the extra price of adding documentation. This will help build a culture of documenting. Don't make documenting more painful than it already is, right? So, another trigger. When in front of a blank page, just focus on why. Why am I doing this? 2 paragraphs. This is the reason. If I don't understand the reason, I should go and ask the product manager, I should go and ask my users, because there must be a reason why we're doing this. Security, business opportunity, we have to explain that. If you understand that, put it there, commit, push, that's a great start, and you've beaten the blank page syndrome, okay? Another option is, on a blank page, use some AI. And a trick that I used to use is I have two IDEs, VS Code, IntelliJ, Eclipse, I don't care. In one, I don't use GitHub Copilot. In the other one, I do use GitHub Copilot. And when I need to write documentation, I go into GitHub Copilot, and it gets me started super fast. I have a blank page, and as I keep on typing, I'm not an English native, so I sometimes need some help. That was great. It really sped me up. What I'm trying to say is that the less friction you have while thinking of documentation, the better. Okay? So again, show of empathy. Very quickly, this is how I submit a PR, push code, describe, review important parts, comment, and then convert it in ready for review. Always create the PR in draft first. Make sure that you are not wasting someone else's time. Okay? And again, reinforce others. Don't be the extra friction. More triggers. Never use acronyms. I was showing earlier some acronyms, and I immediately came out of it. Another thing, never press return before you've read. And what I mean here is, do not press enter and follow this instead. Write, read, reduce, repeat, write, read, reduce, repeat. And by these, and by reduce, I mean shorter sentences, no adverbs. In documentation, you don't need adverbs forever. Like we don't need adverbs in coding. In coding, we have names and verbs. We don't have adverbs. And make sure the documentation is not coupling with the code, because the moment you refactor the code, you will have to go and change the documentation, and documentation will become unmaintainable. And finally, about short sentences, be mindful of the music. I will just fly through this, share the slides later, read it up. Even if I said use shorter sentences, don't take it as a golden rule. So, at this point, I met a sorcerer, and the sorcerer said, Ignasi, you are now worthy of the box. And I said, what's in the box? Oh, never mind, you'll find out. What the hell are you meaning? You're giving me an artifact, a magical artifact, and you're not giving me the documentation. And he said, yeah, okay, I've been partially listening to your talk. We can discuss later. So at this point, because I had won this artifact, I was no longer an archer. I was a knighthood student. I was at Knight College, at Knighthood University, they call it there. And so that gave me access to the higher-ups, to the royalties. And I said, hey, if I have access to the royalties, I can talk to stakeholders, I can tell them how documentation can help us save money. This is a radio bullet. Save money and time. How? Focus on onboarding. This onboarding content, anytime you spend writing good onboarding content is speeding up whoever you hire. In the onboarding as well, enforce a good writing training, a good writing culture. Squeeze in links that I shared at the first part of this presentation. Squeeze in the Google Tech writing course so that when someone joins your company, immediately clicks and says, okay, I now have the tools. I now understand that the company is going towards this direction. This friend of mine was telling me the other day how he had an interview over Slack, because that's how they evaluate how that person will communicate. It's a remote-first company, all written communication over Slack. So they even went as far as take this into their interviewing process. Follow the improv rule. Yes, and. Nothing to add here. In the onboarding process, tell the candidates to start with some documentation task. Why? They will learn the product faster. They will understand the structure of the documentation so that when they have to improve that documentation, they will already know, okay, focus on the structure of the documentation, then it's the same thing that you would do with the code. Hey, here's the code, here's the manager, here's the persistent, blah, blah. I know code, I can navigate code, but I don't know how your company organizes documentation, so do that. This is another bullet point. Documentation, in my opinion, should be compulsory for anything that cannot be Googled. And now I look at the camera because I know that some colleagues in the future will see this recording. I'm talking at you, platform, who are just pushing features down our throats. Anything that cannot be Googled must be documented. Otherwise, you're shooting yourself in the foot. You're spending money on building some abstraction over Terraform, and you're not telling your users how to use it or where this documentation that users wrote is, right? Other things, SOPs or deployment processes. Okay, trigger, SOP, standard operating procedure. Okay? This is another bullet point. once you've written something, make it discoverable and tell the world that thing exists. It's not just, hey, we delivered this feature. Yeah, we've delivered this feature and the user manual is there, right? So how or where to put things? First, follow a convention. All documentation that's of this kind will be here. All documentation that's of that kind will be there. So depending on your audience, depending on the type of documentation, put things in different places so that it's easy to know by convention where to expect some documentation to be. Or even better, make it discoverable. In my current work, we use Confluence. In Confluence, there's a very nice feature, which is you can search emojis on the search box up there, right? So anytime I write a how-to guide, anytime I write a user manual or a reference manual, I prefix it with a book, so that I don't know exactly what is it that I'm looking, but I put the book, and then I have some auto-completion, and then, oh yeah, I want how-tos. And all how-tos start with how-to colon. And all user manuals start with manual colon, right? So it's very trivial to find things by convention. Or even better than convention, put links everywhere. This is the Datadog dashboard for some service, whatever. Add an extra markdown note with links to all the necessary information the person looking at this will need, because most likely the person looking at this will be looking at this because there's an outage, because there's some error or whatever, and may not be familiar with all the details. And even better than putting links is just putting the documentation in place. If you've done the documentation first, you can just copy-paste it here, at least the relevant parts. Here's where you don't need to be dry and not repeat yourself. It's all the opposite. You have to be wet and write every single time. Just copy-paste. If your documentation is right, it's focused about facts, it's focused about concepts that will never change. And the moment these concepts changes, you'll have a more bigger problem than documentation going outdated. So copy it, put it in place. This is another dashboard in where the markdown tells everything you need to know to understand what these two donuts represent. So conventions are good, discoverability is better, links are even better, in-place documentation beats them all. We're all familiar with in-place documentation. We all have Java docs. So at this point, I was no longer a knighthood scholar, but then something happened. I saw at the end of the hill a mob with pitchforks and torches coming my way, and I said, okay. I poked a bear, and the other developers are pissed at me. They are now about to kill me. But to my surprise, when they just were 2 meters away, they said, Ignasi, we need your help. And I, what do you mean you need my help? Yeah, we have a big dragon lurking, and it started to destroy everything. And I said, what? And I couldn't even understand, I couldn't even process what was happening, that I got a call from the Princess Regent, the PR, and she said, Ignasi, you are now the knighthood. You're now the knight. I hereby demand you to beat this dragon. Meanwhile, the dragon, of course, wrote havoc all over the place, things on fire, people screaming, and I'm like, okay, I think I pissed my pants. And with my pants pissed, I jumped on a horse, out of the wall, get out of the horse, or I don't know the phrasal verb in English or whatever, dawn, and face the dragon. The air was thick, the air was tense. And the dragon attacked first. And the dragon said, yeah, but documentation is hard to maintain. And I replied, yeah, but the documented code is harder to maintain. And so we started circling around each other. And he said, yeah, but I don't know where to explain or how much in detail. And I said, yes, I know, but focus on the why. I said this earlier, some docs is better than no docs. Put yourself on the user's shoes, show some empathy. Yeah, I know, but this code is very stable. No one is editing it. Yeah, sure, but have you heard of LS or tail? They've been stable for eons, and they're still there. People will still use your code once you're gone. So be mindful of them. Yeah, but I don't know where to store the docs. Yeah, just write something. put it on a markdown. We will edit, we will put it later. We will develop the convention as we go. Just put documentation out there, and eventually we will find some patterns. It's similar like code. Just code, deploy, push, and then eventually we will refactor and put things into place. It's code with a different programming language. Yeah, but it takes time. Okay, well, that's funny because I have a full slide deck about this topic. I can share with you. Yeah, but I already answered this a million times on Slack. Yeah, and in the time that we've had this conversation, I searched it. Now that I know it's on Slack, I searched it, I copied it, and I put it on the conventional place where it was supposed to be living. This knowledge should be there, not in Slack. Yeah, but I'm the team lead. You can ask me anything. It's all in my head. Okay, I have a question for you. Have you ever heard about the push factor? At this point, the dragon was super pissed and he started shouting at me. But my code is the documentation, he said, and my types tell you exactly what is it that you need. And I said, okay, I have one for you. Have you ever heard about string split and big decimals scale? No? Okay, let me tell you a story. Let's talk about Java string. Who knows string split? Everyone has used string split. What's the value, what's the meaning of the second argument? It's an integer. What does it do? What? Yeah, but what happens if the number is higher than the limit or the number is lower than the limit? What happens with the separators? For example, look at this case. The limit was 8 and the separator appeared on the output. I didn't expect the separator to be on the output, right? It's a separator. I don't want it there. And I only will know that if I read the documentation, and the documentation explains that. Let's talk about Java big decimal. What's the value on these two evaluations? Big decimal dot value of. In one case, I have 8 digits and a 2. In the other case, I have the same 8 digits and a -2. And big decimal, it's some long times 10 to the power of something, right? And we've all done math, and we all know that if the power is positive, I'm multiplying by 10, 100, 1,000. If negative, I'm dividing by 10, 100, 1,000. Except, this is backwards. And you will only know if you read the documentation. And even if you read the documentation was so confusing to me at some point that I went to GitHub and sent a PR. So since Java 18, this is no more clear. And at this point, having proved to the dragon that he had no valid argument that I could counter, I realized, hold on, I know how to beat him. I have all the knowledge that I needed to share with him. It's on a box. The sorcerer gave it to me. So I gave the box, jumped on his mouth when he was about to spit some fire, and I said, here, swallow it. And that was it. I won. So at this point, I was no longer a knight on a horse. I was a developer level 23. And this is it. You all now know what I had to share. But I made some promises today, and I intend to keep them. For example, I said that at the end of the content, we had to review the expectations. So these are the 5 steps that I said that I would cover, except that I lied. They are not review bullets. They are not bullet points. They are an ordered list. And they are an ordered list because this process matters. First, you evolve yourself, think, then you detect what works and you hack yourself, and then you build the habits to not fall back. And once you are there, you're stable on that position, you can go and talk to the stakeholders, because without the necessary support, without these stakeholders, without the power to make decisions supporting your push, you will not be able to rally the troops. Right? Or put another way, a lot simpler, kicks, tricks, triggers, monies, and troops. Finally, some links and follow-ups. I already told you everything that I know. I already shared all the links that I used. Start here. This is 1 hour of dedication or less. It says 1.5, but it's really a very short course and very interesting. And this is it. Here's some references. All the images, except explicitly, are DALL-E 2. The dragon challenges and how to beat them is something that I asked some people on a Slack community back in Barcelona for help. And any reference to the triplets is thanks to Roser Capdevila and Mercè Company. But I could finish here, except if you've read the GeeCON website, you may be expecting something more. I said there would be a tale about the emperor, and I didn't deliver on that. So here it is. The board witch was bored, and the triplets were doing a mess. So the board witch went to check up on them. And as a punishment, she took them to the middle of the forest. And in the forest, there was a split on the path, and they met this tailor. And the tailor said, "Hey, kids, do you know where the castle is?" And the kid says, yeah, it's this way. But that was a lie. The castle was actually the other way. And that's what they did. They followed the other way, they arrived at the castle, and they impersonated the tailor. They got some cloth, they took some measurements, they took some drawings, and they did the emperor new clothes. They really did. And when he showed up the next morning, everyone was in awe. And the board witch, knowing that the emperor was now dressed like Superman, started laughing, "Ah, you're like Superman." And the emperor took that as an offense, and he ordered, "Guards, take that woman dressed very strangely, but she's a witch, she has a broom." So she went away flying, but she didn't know that the emperor could fly as well. Thank you very much. This is The Emperor is a Superhero. Thank you. So, time for questions, if this is properly, okay, that's brilliant. Obsolescence of the dog. I will do something that I wouldn't like if someone else did to myself, but I will do it anyway. What about obsolescence of the code? It's the same thing. It's thank you. I now have a fan club, man. It's the same thing. They all go hand in hand. What about the obsolescence of the tests? It's a triplet. It's test, code, and documentation. It's not coincidence that I took the triplets. Actually, it is, but I just realized it fits perfectly. Maybe next question. Why 100% test coverage is bad? Okay, that's not the topic of the talk. I'm sorry about that. We can discuss this for hours. It's a personal opinion that I know some other people also share. I think that a good, reasonable threshold between 75 and 85. That's all I can share. What do you think about enforcing Javadoc for all public APIs? I mean, document functions like get, count, and enforcing sections as return and throws. I think it's a good starting point. You should not strive to document absolutely everything. And if people hate documenting, they will start making everything private, which is a double win. So it's not bad. Yeah, anything that's public can be used outside of its intended use. So better take care of that. Is it better to write longer docs or rather refactor code to be more readable? It depends on the team. If you're writing too much, it means that there's too much to explain, maybe some refactoring. I would go with refactoring, I think. But it depends on the case. I don't have enough first-hand experience on this particular case. How to enforce people to read the documentation? This is a very good one. I like this question. One other way to make people write documentation is to enforce the following behavior, which is anytime you're asked something on Slack, don't answer. Go onto documentation, find it, share the link, go onto the documentation. Oh, it's not there. Improve the documentation, and then share the link. Right? Slack is not a documentation repository. Slack is a messaging application. Documentation should be in place. If you keep pushing people, if you keep telling where the information is, they will develop, they will learn where to go and find it. That's how you end up enforcing people to read the documentation. You're not enforcing them, you're inviting them, you're showing them, you don't need for me to be online. You can be coding at 3 and the information is already there. You only need to know where it is. Okay, I am out of time. There are no more questions, but if you bear with me, does anyone miss something? This is out of script, but I had a few more slides ready. If you want to bear with me, anyone? This is completely out of the content. Yes? Shall we? Okay. If you read the GeeCON page, on the GeeCON page when I introduced myself, where I said what the content would be, I said that the documentation is also used or necessary on cards plays, right? Or table games, board games, right? And no one said, hey, but Ignasi, you didn't cover this part. You covered these 2 paragraphs, you covered the Emperor tale, yada, yada. And no one said, hey, I'm missing this bit. But, okay, I prepared. So let's talk about Uno. And I'm talking about the official instructions that you can find here, okay? And this is one pet peeve of mine. I will not discuss if +2 and +4 can be stacked. Can anyone tell me when can you play +4? Does anyone know? When can? Wait. I have a few answers. What do you mean it depends? No. We're talking about the official rules. It's recorded. The correct answer, Jean-Philippe, I now owe you a beer, is when you cannot play anything else. But there's more. What's more? Do you know? If I play a +4 on you, you have the power to challenge me. And I have to show you all my cards. And if I could have used the color, I swallow +8. And if I don't, because of your challenge, you swallow +8. Well, read the fucking manual. Jonathan, I've been saying that for an hour. Come on, pay attention. But my pet peeve with this is that it has a very similar API with the +2. And the +2 rules are completely different. You can only play it when the color matches, you cannot stack them, and you cannot challenge them, and blah, 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 blah. But here's the last thing I want to share today. Who in this audience knows when do you win at Uno? Who is the winner at Uno? Oh, your kid must know my wife. So, who is the winner of Uno? What? No? Anyone? No? The general answer is, okay, the one that plays the last card and has a hand free of cards, right? Except that's not true. That's the winner of that Uno round. An Uno game is many Uno rounds. And when I win a round, everyone shows their cards. I count all the numbers of those points. No. Yeah. It's similar to what you said, but what you said is not entirely right. Jean-Philippe, no, follow. So I win the round. I count the points. And these points are for me. And I will win if I am the first at 500 points. And this is so important that it's twice on the manual. It's once there, and it's once there, and no one knows. And that's all I got.